The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Morning, everybody. This is Colonel Play. I'd like to welcome you back to day 3 of the KCIS conference titled In Case of Emergency. At this time, I'll turn it to Trey Braun to provide a few opening remarks.
Hello, I'm Trey Braun from the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. I get the privilege of introducing today's event and kind of putting it in context. As Chad just said, this is day 3 of a 4-day conference. We had a outstanding first couple of days between panelists and keynote speakers. General Ayer started us off on a great foot, and then we had kind of an overview panel for panel 1 that went through the threats to national security that may generate national emergencies. We had a very good briefing on the Canadian military response to the pandemic, and then we had a U.S. FEMA Department of Homeland Security overview on some of the activities that are underway in the United States to improve our program for responding to future crises. Then yesterday we had another great panel of speakers that talked about the stress test, a book that they had written, Stress Test the COVID-19 Pandemic, and then Canadian National Security, that went into great detail about Canada's experience. And then we had a panel team made up mostly of NATO allies that laid out many of the national armed force coordinated responses and interaction between national militaries to respond to the pandemic in Europe, which leads us to the panel for today, which is going to lay out land force implications and get into some of the more operational and enterprise management, structure, equipment, and training issues. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the MC to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Trey. So before I begin with the next speaker, first, I just want to go over again. If you have questions during the guest speaker, and then later on for the panel, you can go to the Q&A button down below to type in your questions, and it'll be asked and answered during the period. And then also, again, for interpretation, as the speakers are speaking either in English or French, and you need interpretation, there's another button, interpretation, a little globe at the bottom, which you can use for that purpose. So for the next speaker, I'd like to introduce Dr. Howard Coombs. He is an associate professor of history at the Royal Military College in Kingston. He is also a part-time Canadian Army reservist with the Office of the Chief of Reserves located at the Canadian Armed Forces National Defense Headquarters. Dr. Coombs received his PhD in military history from Queen's University, and his research interests are Canadian professional military education, military operations, and training. And in 2020, Dr. Coombs was the first Canadian Mobilizing Insight Defense and Security Program Fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome, Italy. Over to you, Dr. Coombs.
Thank you very much, Chad. Welcome, everybody. Today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome on everyone's behalf former United States Navy Rear Admiral John Polovchek, who served as the White House supply chain lead on the coronavirus task force to help the United States meet medical supply demand at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. In this role, he embedded within the United States Department of Health and Human Services to rapidly increase the supply and speed of delivery of medical items for frontline healthcare workers. Prior to that, he served as the Vice Director for Logistics to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I had to put this in Canadian terms, advising on the sustainment of a force of about 1.5 million people. Over the course of more than 30 years service with the United States Navy, he held numerous command and staff positions and received much recognition of his outstanding military contributions. He retired in 2020 and is currently a managing director at Ernst & Young Global Limited, one of the largest professional services networks in the world. On behalf of the Kingston Consortium on International Security, I invite Rear Admiral Polovchek to provide today's keynote address.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. John Polovchek, and what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time rounding out my background, and then get into what I did on the task force, and then end with a discussion on the topic that the conference is settled on. You know, the role of the military, the role of DoD in crisis, and I think you might be surprised at my opinion at the end of this, and so I'm gonna look to leave time for questions. Right. So a little bit more about myself. So, a 34-year career, naval officer, a graduate of the United States Naval Academy with an engineering degree. Managed to find myself in the Navy's business end. I'm a Navy, was a Navy Supply Corps officer. And so through that, I've had the chance to develop and work in different areas of sustainment for the Navy, primarily supply chain. But with that, I have a background in financial management. So I've been a Navy comptroller, managing large chunks of the Navy's budget, whether that was in a acquisition program. So I was the business financial manager in the Seawolf program, that program that was buying new submarines. I was the comptroller for the Atlantic Fleet. And within that regard, I had about a $13 billion annual budget to support both operations and maintenance of the fleet. As a flag officer, I owned all the Navy's business systems, so I have a little bit of an IT background. As a junior officer, I was a warranted contracting officer and working major program acquisitions. So I supported some research and development contracting within the Naval Sea Systems Command. So I have an acquisition background as well. And I've also done a fair amount of logistics planning. So both in the Navy, on the Navy staff, on the Chief of Naval Operations staff, I started to write and develop new logistics concepts for the Navy to go along with operational concepts that the Navy was writing. And then certainly on the Joint Staff, I supported the efforts, Joint Force Management for global force management across the globe. And we did, at that time, Secretary Mattis had us doing a significant amount of planning for contingencies, some well-known, some not well-known. And I think as you walk through my background, I became the obvious choice to move from the Pentagon to Health and Human Services and FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, based on all of that. And so if you go back to the beginning of the pandemic in March of 20, I was called at home on Sunday, March 15th, by the director of the Joint Staff with a, "Hey, John, we'd like you to go over," we being the chairman and deputy secretary of defense, "we'd like you to go over to Health and Human Services and help them plan for the pandemic. It's all going to be logistics." And so with that was my undertaking to go understand what Health and Human Services had been doing, what FEMA was doing. By that Wednesday, I was asked to go see then Vice President Pence and talk about standing up a supply chain task force. And really, when I think about it, Health and Human Services at that time, so that department really had no expertise in large scale planning efforts and large scale mobilizations. And the Joint Staff J4 mobilization, industrial base mobilization, was in what I'll call our job drawer. And so I had been thinking about what does industrial base mobilization mean, and what does it look like in great power competition? So, what might industrial base mobilization need to be in, say, 2030, 2035? And so I came into Health and Human Services with an understanding of the Defense Production Act and those thoughts about what might be industrial base mobilization. And it became clear to me that Health and Human Services did not have that capacity. So I'm just going to run you quickly through some of what the task force did and kind of how I organized it, and use maybe one example to show you the lack of deep planning, which is essentially a skill set, or what I'll call a normal line of operation for the Department of Defense, especially the Joint Staff and the services. So met Vice President Pence on a Friday. By Sunday, I was attending Saturday, Sunday, attending my first COVID task force meetings. And Sunday, Vice President Pence pulled out a slide and said, "Hey, John, this when we get done here, you're going to go up to the Oval Office and you're going to brief the standing up of this task force." And I had about a half hour to get my thoughts together. And next thing I know, I'm on the White House podium briefing the nation. And really, back then, it was probably most of the globe was tuning into some of those guests. But the backdrop I walked into was the national stockpile for the United States had been given out. Essentially, I'm going to keep this to just supplies that were in very high demand, and not even get into testing, therapeutics, vaccine. I certainly did some things that got handed off to Operation Warp Speed here to go build the vaccine requirement. But the national stockpile had been distributed on a pro rata share to the states. And as a DoD logistics planner, the first words out of my mouth were like, "Okay, so that's great. How about the surge contracts you have in place to surge the industrial base to make more?" And I got blank stares, frankly. And so I was like, "Great, I'm in charge of the supply chain, and I don't have any supplies, and there's nothing on order, and so this is a great place to be." And so I created 4 lines of effort. And so taking a kind of a DoD mentality and a planning mentality, the first line of effort was preservation, which was, the things that we had on hand, the things that were already available in the United States. We're going to do things to make them go last longer. So that became the reuse of masks and things like that. The second line of effort was I had people scouring the globe to go buy things. And that became a line of effort that I termed acceleration. And that really became something called AirBridge, where we partnered with the commercial side. As we were buying things and flying them in, we worked with the commercial networks and flew their product in, as well as the things that the federal government were buying, and aiding distributed them, to break the 30+ day cycle time of the maritime transport from Asia. And really, all of this was required because nationally, the United States did not make many things and many medical supplies holistically in North America. The third line of effort is an effort where I think you really get to see where my brain is this allocation line of effort. And really, it's the data line of effort where we partnered with 9 medical distribution companies and had access to their information, their daily business data from their customers, what their orders were, what they had on hand, what was coming in from manufacturing and their sources, and what was being delivered. And that line of effort ended up being a supply chain control tower that was a public-private partnership to help us prioritize distribution of supplies that we had on hand and that was being manufactured overseas or manufactured in the United States and passing through this commercial network. Because again, the feds didn't have anything and the commercial guys did. And so knowing that success is normally linked to the industrial base, I chose to partner with the commercial side pretty strongly. And the final line of effort was really the primary line of effort, where we used the Defense Production Act to make more in North America. That's where you saw the DPA use for ventilators, N95 masks, surgical gowns, whatever the supplies were, nasal swabs for testing, test kits, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll see the use of the DPA in the vaccine work, et cetera. And so really those 4 lines of effort allowed us to dig out from a significant lack of understanding of, I will say, the planning really needed for a national emergency. And I'm not looking to point fault or point fingers or lay blame, but agencies other than the Department of Defense in the United States lacked significant bandwidth for that planning, and then lacked significant bandwidth for the acquisition of things. And so, for example, when we went off and bought 200,000 plus ventilators, I think that number was about 230, 250, and spent $2 billion. I looked at the Health and Human Services team and FEMA and said, hey, how big is your acquisition staff? And they looked at me and they said, well, you the contracting people? And I said, yes. I said, well, that plus, the program managers, auditors, everybody else that's part of what I would call the acquisition core. And they looked at me and said about 100 people. And I knew we were probably in for a little bit of a rough road, because we made about 30,000 ventilators in America in a year. Now we're going to buy 200,000 from American companies. Gee, there'll be no supply chain problems. Everybody's probably competing for the same electric motor, the same filter, the same hose, the same something. And so I tapped into what I'll call the legions of people within DoD, and that really deep bandwidth of the folks that know how to manage large programs from cradle to grave. And so it might sound like I'm going to be a very large advocate for a large DoD role in future crises. But what I'm describing to you are gaps that I see. And so, I think this pandemic, we were fortunate that the pandemic wasn't a precursor to other events. And I can scenario out multiple scenarios, whether it be a cyber, whether it be another type of pandemic, where we might not be so lucky. What if we were trying to deploy DoD military forces in a large capacity? What if there was a cyber event that took down the banking industry, prevented transportation, disrupted power, water supply, food? At the same time, we're trying to get military forces from fort to port to deployed overseas in a great power competition. DoD might not be available. And so what I think my COVID lesson learned is, on one point, you can't surge what you don't have. And that may sound absolutely simple and a blinding flash of the obvious, but we didn't have anybody to surge within Health and Human Services that had the skills and the bandwidth that I brought with me, and I brought the DoD team with me from the Joint Staff and the services over to Health and Human Services and to FEMA to stand up this task force, which included members and representation from across the federal government and commercial entities. That capacity, those skill sets, financial skill sets, large program acquisitions from nuclear submarines to aviation to others, and the deep planning that I developed on the Joint Staff and within the services, along with some modicum of understanding of the requirements that you need to have for information and data management in these capacities. So what if DoD is occupied? Where is that going to come from? And really, in the United States, I think we're lucky to have an organization that's at the ready with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I thought I knew FEMA very well from my planning days, my work with the staff for contingencies, whether it be a hurricane, whether it be other disasters. And I thought I had spent a lot of time with FEMA until I spent about a year of my life with them managing this crisis. And so FEMA is really the US's crisis management organization. And so the gaps and seams that I kind of laid out on supply chain planning, logistics planning, I think that the combination of each agency within the federal government, with the U.S. federal government, whether it's the Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy, Department of Health and Human Services, I think they all need a modicum. Every one of those cabinet secretaries needs a level of detail that they probably don't have. And I'm not advocating for significant growth in the government. Health and Human Services is on a path to create an office that manages an industrial base. And that's really several govies and some support contractors. And realize that there would be a partnership with the Department of Defense, but Health and Human Services would be in the lead. So that's one point. I think that there's a slight need to grow capacities in certain areas. And then the second point I would kind of leave you with is the Defense Production Act is not a light switch. It's a rheostat. We went from producing somewhere around, I'll just say 30 million N95 masks a month in the United States, to by the end of the summer, beginning of the fall, we were on our way to about 200 million a month. And really by the time, Christmas happened and New Year's, it was about 280 million masks a month. And so you can see that's, hey, we DPA'd you with a magic wand, go make masks. It doesn't work like that. We had to pour concrete, buy machines, train laborers, right? I mean, the DPA is not a magic wand. And so it takes time. And so the other gaps and seams that I found goes back to when I asked a very simple question. Hey, you have surge contracts, right, for the national stockpile. So once you issue something, something's going to be on order. And the answer was no. And so the second point is really public-private partnerships. And so I think, from a DoD mentality, the Defense Logistics Agency within the Department of Defense manages a program that I think we've labeled the War Stopper. There's a lot of supplies that are in that, things that you don't want to enter a large contingency and not have, whether it be cots, tents, basic supplies, where things are on a surge basis. Like you have inventory on hand, the contractor has inventory, and then you've paid for capacity. And so public-private partnerships, or what I'll term whole of America approach, I think are more effective than relying on DoD to just be there and surge, right? And so it takes an amount of thought and planning and bandwidth to put in place these concepts of public-private partnerships that can be there. Now, as the vignette that I've used to describe some of this, as a Navy guy, I've managed munitions for the Department of Defense for many years, where they are, move them around in contingency, set levels, etc. And the vignette I use is, we have enough Tomahawk cruise missiles on hand for any contingency, but we keep Tomahawk cruise missiles on low rate production, and we buy a small amount of every year. And we essentially keep the lines warm and open to be able to surge. And I go back to the Health and Human Services team. And again, they were sized decades like this. So this was decades in the making. And it wasn't like that administration, those leaders, they just did not see themselves, right? And so Health and Human Services did not have that mentality of, hey, I have to be ready for a long fight. I have to have depth. I have to have maybe echelons of supply. And so, I can look across, the medical supply chain and think about, wow, they are really sized for day-to-day operations with very little bandwidth to surge. Inventory is really, if you want to see a just-in-time operation, most hospitals don't have warehouses attached to them. They have these companies that deliver stuff every day. In fact, they're synced with surgeries. You're going to get a box that morning. A very lean organization with not a lot of surge capacity in them. And so I think the way forward for most contingencies, and I'm going to qualify this because I don't think I have all of the answers, but for most contingencies, I believe we are inextricably linked to the commercial sector. Whether it be in transportation, whether it be in the output of goods, we're linked. And so the federal government, DoD, other cabinet secretaries, must have ways to manage an industrial base. And so you'll see this debate now within the United States. And that's where I'm kind of directing my comments, because I'm not going to talk about every other nation here. But within the United States, lots of conversation about supply chains. Lots of conversations in Congress, lots of conversations about the national stockpile, lots of conversations about giving the Department of Commerce authorities to do stress tests for supply chains. And really, in the end, those conversations all end up with a deep sense of planning and an understanding that they have to get into public-private partnerships. So let me go back to go forward. We spent a lot of money. We stood up a lot of US capacity. We made a lot of things in America. We haven't done the rest of the work to pull other economic levers and do things to keep viable the medical industrial base that we built. I won't say fear, but unless we do things to keep viable, and I'm not trying to say that I think to roll back globalization, but there must be some amount of not protection, but things that we could do that that allows the demand and the capacity that we build to be competitive across the globe, and have enough consumption that surge is there. And I think that the essence will be a public-private partnership to build surge, keep surge, and manage surge. And I'm directing my comments to the medical industrial base, whether it be pharmaceuticals, whether it be things, needles, syringes. Think about the capacity that we've built to be agile, to bring vaccines to the market. I can think of many sinister scenarios where that agile capacity should be maintained because of what might come next. And so I believe that DoD has a role. It probably has a role to be somewhat of a model or a benchmark for some of the planning efforts and some of the ways that we've approached operational contingencies and being ready and building readiness. I think departments across the agency heads, departments across the federal government probably have some gaps and seams in their ability to plan and manage contingencies. I think those gaps need to be solved. But really, I think we have the widest gap is in the public-private partnerships. And for the United States, the DPA Title VII allows us to get into some deep partnerships and share information and share data. And that's probably my last point. If you think about bringing together 9 commercial companies, getting their daily transactional business information, put it into the cloud at FEMA, bring in a supply chain illumination tool from DoD, and develop a supply chain control tower where I can overlay where COVID was most prevalent. Really, if you remember Dr. Burks, I worked very closely with her and her data team to prioritize where supplies needed to go. That data environment did not exist. That data environment, which we've now transferred and brought in hospital information and nursing home information, we had to go create that data environment. Public-private partnership in that environment, the data to be able to see supply chains. I can think of many scenarios. What if it was a cyber event? What if it was something where we were trying to manage scarcity of energy, water, food? How can we see it? And so I think those public-private partnerships need to be thought about now. And so they can be implemented in crisis instead of and being more eloquent. I mean, I created something that was done very, very much a human endeavor. It worked. We made it better as we went. But it wasn't very eloquent in the beginning. No, but it worked. And so, taking the time now to build those public-private partnerships. And so I think I'm going to end with those points and open up for questions. So again, thank you for having me. It may not be the answers that you were looking for. I think there's a slimmer role for DoD going forward, because what if we were in a major conflict? I think public-private partnerships are the way to go, because that's where the deep capacity to serve nations are. So thanks for having me.
Admiral, thank you very much. There's a number of questions already in the chat, but I'm going to exercise my prerogative as the greeter, so to speak, and ask you a question that may seem somewhat odd, but it fits within research that I normally do. In terms of your military career and your professional military education, your PME experiences, which of these best prepared you to deal with the demands of the COVID-19 task force?
I think that's actually a very easy question, and I'm glad you asked it. I started with, I was an engineering major from the Naval Academy, and we got sucked into the Navy's business end. I went to the Naval Postgraduate School for acquisition and contracting, which was really a couple of marketing classes shy of an MBA. But with that gave me some business acumen and understanding large program management and how to manage the business deals for the Department of the Navy. But what really, I think, set me apart and really aided my development was my attendance to the Eisenhower School. Back when I went, it was called ICAF, Industrial College of the Armed Forces. But the Eisenhower School is that institution that was stood up to ensure that we understand what I'm talking about being inextricably linked with industry, and a school uniquely set up to help military officers and civilians think through mobilization. And I think about my industry study. I think about other industry studies. I think about the coursework there. That singular professional military education, I think, really helped me understand using all levers of the federal government and the authorities that Congress has given us to set up a whole America approach and lean on and partner with the commercial sector. And so it was foundational. ICAF was foundational to my development.
Thank you. That was a great answer. I scribbled some notes for some follow-up stuff I'm doing. The first question I'll pose from the ones that have come in from the audience is from Professor Trey Braun of the Strategic Studies Institute. And he says, what is required to motivate the American federal government, the President and Congress, to develop capabilities throughout the interagency pre-emergency or preparedness portion? Is your suggestion that tasks and capabilities should be better aligned with agency department expertise versus reaching out to DoD because they have the capability and take on these missions when asked?
Yeah, so Professor Braun, you and I have talked, and I do think Congress gets these facts, and that's why I'm actually happy to see that they're going to give authorities and tasks Department of Commerce to understand supply chains in a deeper sense, right? Health and Human Services they had an agency within the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response called BARDA, and I forget what the acronym stands for. It doesn't really matter. But BARDA was a research and development arm of ASPR, and trying to think through needs and contingency. But BARDA was really focused on the next shiny object and did not have the ability to manage a medical industrial base. So I go back to your capacity question. So DoD has immense capacity in its acquisition core to manage a defense industrial base. Because frankly, nobody cares about nuclear submarines like DoD cares, right? I mean, there's not a consumer end of it. And so we have to care about it. So that mentality, I think, is what's a gap in certain sectors of the federal government, to go from regulatory to operational, and that's been the crux to the issue, and that's the gap that, frankly, FEMA needs to help close. And so DoD is the easy button, but I think this conference probably worked through some scenarios, and I think yesterday was your day to talk about what the future might look like, or I forget how you stated it, but we could all detail out horrible contingencies. And again, what if DoD is occupied, and that capacity is needed to do other things? And so I just think that Congress gets these facts, and so they're asking Health and Human Services and others to step up and do more of these public-private partnerships to solve things. Look, Health and Human Services and the National Stockpile folks, in fact, the National Stockpile folks were in the CDC, and they viewed themselves as like warehousemen. I can't say in any planner. And they didn't have the deep understanding of what they might have to do for the long fight, and so they just didn't do the planning. So somebody has to be there, and that capacity just can't be the easy button from the DoD. It's a long answer because it's a very complicated problem, but it's not a growth in the federal government. It's probably a realignment of some capacities, and I think FEMA needs to be in the dead center of that.
Okay, Admiral, I've got another question for you from Colonel Chad Pillay, who is our U.S. Army Visiting Defense Fellow. And it's a great supply chain type question. He asks, how did the lure of the mass industrial mobilization in the United States during World War II negatively impact the response after a long period of rapid deindustrialization, where most items needed are made in part or totally overseas?
That was the essence of the problem, right? So absolutely, right? And so, I'm just going to focus on some of the things that we tackled right away, and not vaccine and not therapeutics. Simple things. We absolutely stopped manufacturing many medical supplies in the United States: needles, syringes, vials, masks, right? And so that's why I say the DPA is not a magic wand. And that's why I say you can't surge what you don't have. And I think there's wide applicability to the DoD. I'm working on an article. I don't think it's a book. I think it's a magazine article that maybe gets published in something like Proceedings. That takes my lessons learned using the DPA and looking at how holistically, 80 some odd % reliant on overseas sources for things. And the thought that we were going to DPA our way out of that reliance in a timely fashion is flawed. And so as I think about surging DoD for a great power competition, that the adage of you can't surge what you don't have applies all the way down to the 5th, 6th, 7th tier supplier. And so I really do think that we're going to have to work through a prioritization. And frankly, look, the Biden administration came in and wrote, like other administrations, a bunch of executive orders, several on the supply chains based on this. And DoD's, working on supply chain response there. And I think the effort would include, or I hope it would include, a deep understanding of what we would need to surge. What is that capacity all the way down the supply chains? And bring back, a modicum of, hey, look, we don't have capacity for, and I just, I'm not making stuff up, but I'm making stuff up. I might need more structural pieces for aviation to get planes at a depot. And so that's not something that you're going to just all of a sudden flick a light switch, DPA somebody and say, make structural components for aircraft. How do you enter into public-private partnerships that have resilient and have agile processes that allow you to surge? Obviously, it's going to cost some resources, but you can't surge what you don't have. So it's an absolutely fundamental question, right? With globalization and the reliance on overseas sources, I think we have to do a better job of deeply understanding those gaps in capacity.
Admiral, thank you. We have more questions. I'm going to.
Yes,
I'm going to ask you another question, and it actually is a great follow-on to what you just discussed, and it's from Dr. Von Lackey, who is the director of the Center for International Defense Policy. How do you maintain the public-private partnerships once the emergency is gone, so that they're there when needed in the future, so that they can be quickly reactivated? And she mentions that you have brought out this mechanism, and you just talked about it in the last answer. But I guess how do you motivate folks to continue in this manner once the emergency is subsided?
Look, that's something that concerns me. Right? I won't use worry. I won't use fearful of. But it's absolutely concerning dynamic. So I'm going to take something very simple, surgical masks. There's the U.S. stood up. We gave money to. Others invested their own resources. We had about 100 different plus companies, small businesses, large size businesses, making surgical masks. Guess what? They're all going out of business because price is king again. And the medical community, and I'm being generic, cares more about price than where it comes from. So what are the other things that you can do? And so this gets to some of the other economic levers and other things. Federal government gives out a lot of money for medical insurance payments, Medicaid, Medicare. What if we used those authorities to mandate some ramp? And I don't know what it is. It's not 50%, or it's not 80% right now. It's probably like 1%. Must have use, buying and use. If you're going to get Medicaid, Medicare dollars, you have to have some amount of items used in your facilities that are manufactured in, I'll say, North America, not just the United States. And so that number today would probably have to be very low, but you could ramp up that requirement and use the Medicaid, Medicare dollars, and it would probably take an influx of resources, some amount of resources. It's probably not trillions, to keep viable a medical industrial base. So I think it's a rethinking of a bunch of levers. And I'll just leave it at that. And I think Congress sees it. So there might be legislation that's in there. But you have to keep in mind, all of this Buy American that has been mandated within the medical space, the federal government buys about 4% of the 100% demand. So that's not going to keep viable a medical industrial base. So it's not a complete answer, but that's kind of where my head is.
Rear Admiral Polovchuk, thank you very much for sharing your
Amiral, merci de nous avoir fait part de votre expérience avec autant de franchise aujourd'hui. Nous apprécions beaucoup la clarté de vos observations et le ton direct sur lequel elles ont été faites. Moi-même, je griffonnais des notes tandis que vous interveniez et vous m'avez donné matière à réflexion sur de multiples points. Préparation d'urgence au niveau national, développement de la capacité dans les ministères civils, au moyen de la planification en cas d'urgence, comment créer cette dynamique hors des cas d'urgence, la nécessité d'approches structurelles mettant en jeu l'ensemble du gouvernement et qui soient de nature permanente ou du moins facilement réactivées en cas de crise. Les forces et faiblesses de la chaîne d'approvisionnement actuelle, il faudrait envisager des approches conceptuelles.
Some of the Cold War studies that I did that were based on Second World War stockpiling and rotation of commodities over time and creating an industrial mobilization base for materiel. Your comments in that regard were certainly enlightening. And indeed, a thought that wouldn't normally occur to me, because I don't like counting a lot, hence I became an arts major, the financial management and contingency planning for national level emergencies within budgets. That had never occurred to me, but when you highlighted it, it seems, oh my God, it's intuitive. It should happen on a regular basis. I don't think it does. So for all these thoughts and more that you offered, thank you. And on behalf of KCIS, have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. I wish this organization well, and I thank you for having me. And this is a wonderful topic, and I hope I aided in any kind of debate and understanding. So thank you for having me.
Admiral Polovchuk, thank you for your comments. Thank you for answering the question that I provided. It was a great overview and topic, and it's something that's worth a future exploration among scholars and practitioners. To Dr. Combs, thank you for running the conversation and taking the Q&A and running an excellent conversation with the Admiral. At this time, we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back at 12 o'clock to begin the next panel.